direct versus representative democracy. I'm Andrea Mattozzi. I'm the head of the economic department at the European University Institute. Let me just spend a few minutes to introduce our distinguished speaker. So I will go alphabetical order. Professor Farrell is a professor of politics, head of politics and international relations at the University College in Dublin. He's a member of the Royal Irish Academy, and his research focuses on the role of deliberation and constitutional reform process, and in particular, we are particularly interested for the purpose of today's topic about the fact that he's the research leader of the Irish Citizen Assembly, which basically is a deliberative mini-publics that was heavily used in Ireland, and is an idea that we want to know more about. Professor Anicini is an Italian senator, is member of the 11th Committee for Labour Market Policy and Welfare States. He's a professor of social and political science at Bocconi, is an expert on, he has written extensively on the selection of politicians, and with some pride, let me also tell that both Professor Farrell and Professor Anicini are UI PhD in politics and in economics. We have Dr. Hans-Gert Pöttering, President of the European Parliament, former Members Association. He was the only member of the European Parliament to serve continuously from 1979 to 2014. So basically we have 35 years of political experience right here. I was chairman of the European Party, People's Party from 1999 to 2007, and has been the president of the European Parliament from 2007 to 2009. Very recently, in 2017, he initiated the House of European History. So let me start immediately by giving you a mini introduction of what is going to be our discussion, and then I'm going to leave space to our distinguished speakers, which, by the way, span basically a nice continuum from politics to academia, with a politician and a professor in between. So why do we want to ask the question, do we really need politicians first? And second, what we can do about it. So the reason for this question is that it's in a number of countries now, we observe an erosion of trust in political institutions. This you can actually document looking at several measures. This is particularly true for national politicians and political parties in the US and Europe, but it's also a phenomenon that affects the European Parliament. We observe a decrease of political participation, so turnout is going down, membership in parties is going down, at least is going even more from the end of the 70s, and there is some evidence that political selection, at least for some countries, is not at its best. So in one sentence, voters are increasingly dissatisfied with political intermediaries, and if you think about representative democracy, political intermediaries are to some extent at the heart of representative democracy. So the vertical dimension of democracy. At the same time, we have this phenomenon of a large popularity gained by various forms of direct democracy. Popular initiative, referendum, citizen assembly, and various forms of e-democracy. So this is something that is more kind of a horizontal way to do policy that does not rely on intermediaries. Of course, I mean, this can have plus and minus, and we're going to be happy to understand more from our speaker, also in light of the recent example of a situation in which deciding very complex, taking very complex policy decisions through a referendum may lead to some problem. So the question that I would like you to address, and I would try to do kind of 2 rounds of 5 minutes intervention, but I mean, you can be free to use your time the way you want, is first to start on what went wrong with the traditional vertical dimension of democracy, and then we can think about what are the remedies to this trust crisis. And I would like to start again from Professor Farrell and then move on. Thanks.
Andrea, thank you very much for the invitation. It's wonderful. It's always wonderful to get back to what I still call the Badia, back to the Institute after so many years. I'm going to annoy you.
I know.
No, I'm going to annoy you because actually I'm glass half full, if you know the analogy. So, and I annoy a lot of people about this. So I'm going to suggest to you that things are bad, but perhaps they're not quite as bad as some of us think. And a lot of the reason I will say that is because of my experience of working in Ireland over the last decades with the Citizens' Assembly, and I'm happy to talk about that experience in my second interjection. But let me start with my sort of more general remarks. And so my concluding point is to say, yes, we need our politicians, but it's our politicians plus. Okay? So my starting point is democracy in crisis. I loved the session earlier on in honor of Peter Mayer, where Dick Katz and Luciano Bardi and Stefano Bartolini were telling the very familiar story in the study of party politics about democracy in crisis, all the difficulties. And of course, all I have to do is mention two words, Brexit and Trump. And already we know the danger signs that are there for democracy. And we know about the steady rise of right-wing populism. We know all of that, and it's rehearsed so many times. But my question is it is perhaps a crisis? Perhaps, but what I think it certainly is a challenge. Democracy is in challenge. And so then my question is, well, is this the first time there have been challenges to democracy? Europe in the 1930s and 1940s, or the 1960s with the civil rights protests and the declining levels of trust shown by all the survey data at that particular point in time. There have been challenges in the past, and so democracy in various ways or others found a way to survive those challenges. And the question I find myself, while we're in the middle of this storm, I find myself wondering is, will democracy survive this challenge too? And I like to think it will. And the reason I think it will is because of the very inherent adaptability that democracy has. It is highly adaptive. And I think often we ignore this. It's adaptive institutionally, in terms of design features, and it's adaptive behaviorally in terms of how we, the citizens, engage with democracy in new and innovative ways ourselves. So I was really struck, Andrea, by your vertical versus horizontal, and when I was thinking about my remarks, I was playing around with that framework of vertical versus horizontal and what other ways I might conceptualize that sort of distinction. So let me try a few in my final moments here. The traditional notion of democracy that we teach in Politics 101 courses to our undergraduates is focus on elections, focus on the representative role of democracy. Well, where is democracy today? As you mentioned in your opening remarks, increasingly now we're moving more towards direct democracy, to a focus of what's going on in between the moment of elections. So that's one way I could conceptualize a distinction. Democracy in the traditional mode was very top-down, elite-led, controlled by our representatives. Whereas increasingly now it's much more bottom-up. Citizens are being brought in various ways into the process, and I wouldn't mind going on about that in my second set of remarks. Democracy was very closed. It was a very closed system where only the elite really knew what was going on. But just think of the open government agenda, freedom of information, whistleblower legislation, register of lobbyists. Suddenly there's a lot more information made available to members of the public that we would not have dreamt of decades before. Democracy used to be very respectful, accepting. The role of the citizen was to be passive. Democracy today is one where the citizens are challenging, they're critical, they're much more active. Democracy used to be, my final point on this, used to be vote-centered. That's the way we conceptualize democracy. And what I want to suggest to you is that democracy increasingly is voice-centered. So what we have to allow for in terms of the way democracy has evolved is a series of reforms that are happening before our eyes: decentralization, open government, petitions for legislation, petitions for referendums, citizens' assemblies, the piece that I'm most interested in. The democracy itself is adapting in various countries at varying speeds with varying degrees of success, at the same time in which citizens themselves are trying to find new ways of engaging with democracy. And so I would want to end with that relatively hopeful note.
Thank you, David. Please.
Thanks a lot for having me. I guess as an Italian politician, I'm in charge of the half-empty glass. about representative democracy. I mean, also jumping on your presentation of my double personality, it's very useful when you are taking a taxi in Rome, because when a taxi driver is asking, what's your job, what are you doing in Rome, you shouldn't answer, I'm a politician, because you can feel the distrust toward politician immediately. You don't need any statistics about reduced turnout. So you play the card, I'm a scholar, I'm teaching some classes, and the discussion can go on. So what's this distrust? I'm perfectly agree, it's nothing new. This vertical dimension, so this delegation exercise that we have in representative democracy, has always brought with it some distrust, because there is an agency relationship. Every agency relationship is unstable by definition. So distrust is something you should deal with. But there are two main problems in the relationship between voters and politicians, as I see it. The first one is what social scientists would call an input legitimacy issue. There is an agency problem. You feel more and more disattached by the political process, how decisions are taken, how collective choices are built. And so there is you don't feel part of the input. You don't feel as an input of the process. So there is an agency. People, voters, need not only to take action once in a while, picking a party, but also being part of the political process. And then there is an issue of output legitimacies, an issue of efficiency, how representative democracy, how politics gets things done, how they solve collective problems. I mean, all these two problems, input and output, are not new, and probably there are different macro trends conspiring to aggravate, to create both crises or both issues. For sure, there is a macro trend of less and less effective tools of the nation states to take decisions, to solve problems, and this has to do with efficiency, but also has to do with agency. There is a secular trend in the increase in the size of government and the need for specialization, the need for representatives, for politicians, not only to take difficult and decisions, but which requires an investment, a costly investment in expertise, but also to control bureaucratic agency, because the political process has very much to do not only with taking yes or no decisions or writing laws. It has a lot to do with the implementation of those decisions and with the implementation of those laws. So another aspect of this vertical dimension, as you said, of democracy is that you need politicians and expert politicians possibly to control bureaucratic agencies. Otherwise, nobody controls who's implementing those decisions. And of course, you have technological change. Technological change is shaping how voters interact between each other on political issues, but also how they organize, how political organization are changing. And this is my last remark. I'm a little bit nostalgic of strong party systems. I'm kind of conscious that in the current political era, you don't need the political parties of the past, but for sure, political parties were coordination devices and were something in which you could solve this tension between input and output legitimacy, because you were part of a collective mission, thanks to ideology, but thanks also to a structured organization. So you were part of the democratic process, you were also and so there was an input issue, but there was also an output issue, because they were a coordination device for people to take decision. I mean, the last remark, I'm a politician, so I'm still in 30 seconds, and the last remark is on on a well-known paper for economists. It's an econometric paper by two Swedish scholars. They use a regression discontinuity design in the early 20th century Sweden to compare municipalities in which decisions are taken by representative democracy, electing politicians, or by direct democracy with town hall meetings and discussions. Their main finding is that direct democracy is reducing redistribution toward the poor, welfare schemes, by large amounts. And their explanation is that with direct democracy and town hall discussion, you have more capture by the elites in the decision-making process because the voting process is not anonymous, because the agenda setting is done by the elite, and because you don't have parties with candidates working for the poor as a coordination device to make their voice heard in the political process. So this result speaks to me to the fact that we need somehow to invest now in a new century, in a new era, to build this coordination device and to have effective political organization and effective ways to select politicians.
Thank you, Tommaso.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrea. I'm not sure whether I understood the structure of our discussion now, but I will try to tell you what I believe. I think, first of all, everything is connected. You cannot separate anything from other things. And each time has its own challenges. And we are always speaking, and I see this now for decades, about crisis. I would rather prefer challenges. I remember when I applied for a scholarship to do some research at Columbia University in New York, the professor asked me, so that I had a reason to get the scholarship, is NATO in crisis? And so this has happened again and again. So I would say each generation has its own challenges. Second point. I heard the sentence, selection of politicians. I'm very frank, I don't like this phrase. Selection means that there is a professor, very intelligent, you are very intelligent, you are wise as well, hopefully. You have wise farmers who might not be intelligent, you have intelligent professors who might not be wise. So selection of politicians is only possible, I would not say in dictatorships or in authoritarian systems, but you can only select politicians if there is somebody who selects politicians. And I give you my experience. I was convinced that we need the European integration for peace. My father was killed in the Second World War. I was born after that. I never got to know him. So you need conviction and to realize what you believe. But then there is nobody telling you, you will become a member of the national parliament or the regional parliament or the European parliament. You have to do it yourself. And I started in the young youth organization of my party, the Christian Democratic Union, and I was convinced about the policy of Konrad Adenauer, who together with Alcide de Gasperi and Robert Schuman started to build Europe. So you need conviction. And then it's a very difficult way to become a member of the European Parliament. You need to go step by step in your own party. There is nobody who says, oh, he is a clever boy, he's a clever girl, or she is a clever girl, she should be a member of Parliament. You have to do it yourself. And if you have the trust in yourself and that you believe in things, in political destination, in political aims, then in the end, one can be successful. It's not a guarantee to be successful. There is, at least in my party, a really competition between those people who want to become a member of Parliament. I was lucky. I had not too many people who were against me, and you know this phrase in German, Ernst, Feind, Parteifreund, enemy, arch enemy, party friend. So I was lucky that this was, in my case, not so much the case. So you have to be convinced by yourself, and you have to have your own beliefs. And if you have the own beliefs and you defend them, then the people trust you. This is my experience. And my second point is, and I think we should be short, I guess, Andrea, we have now in the world what they call the Identitären in German, the identity of people. And I say we have not only one political identity, not only our national identity. We have the identity, in my German language, is Heimat, the local level where you are at home, and the word Heimat in German is very emotional. Heimat means the local level where you have your family, where you have your friends, where you like to live. Those who live here in Firenze, this is their Heimat. And then you have the regional level, but let's leave that out for a moment because it complicates things. Then you have the national level. And then, of course, you have the European level. So you have at least 3 identities. And we have to tell the people that we have 3 identities. And by e-governance or e-democracy, which is an additive thing, I am not against it, but you will never get by instruments, by techniques, any emotion. So you need always politicians who have their heart and their intelligence with the local level, with the national level, and with the European level. And my last, in this first round, comment is, if you only see your local level, so important it might be, you will not defend it. And if you think your nation, America first, or as we said in our German language, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, Germany, Germany above everything. Fortunately, this is not the case anymore, so we abolished this sentence of our national hymn. It was in the time of Hitler and before. Or like the British, when they said, right or wrong, my country, whatever my country does, it's right, I defend it. No. If you put your nation above all other nations, then this is nationalism, and nationalism leads to war. And if you only feel as a European, then you have no roots. So these 3 identities belong together, the local level, the national level, the European level, and we have achieved so much, which is a good basis to say the glass is half full. And if you are a pessimist and if you think we will fail, then we will fail. And I say as a Christian, and this is maybe the deepest belief of my Christianity, we have to be optimistic, because optimism is the only or the main reason to be in the end successful. And so I ask everybody here, not only in the room, to be engaged in politics to make this world a little better. The European Union is not a paradise, but it's, I think, the better part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. So before coming back to you, David, I would like to challenge Tommaso. So regarding the political selection. So in a sense, is there complementarity between individuals and institutions or not? It's more kind of Buchanan, or is more like Madison, or it's just a profession like Weber was thinking?
What I guess you're pushing me to do is a little bit of translation between how in economics we use this term selection of politicians and how it's perceived in the real world. I don't know why, as economists, we always distinguish the real world from our thoughts, but by the way. What we mean by selection of politicians is not a technocratic selection process in which you just pick the more skilled or the smarter guy around. I don't believe in this selection process. I mean, I know a lot of smart guys, much smarter than me in writing papers, but I wouldn't pick them to manage my condo association, not to speak about my country. So it's not a technocratic selection process. It's really how you get on top in politics and how you have a space of political discussion and structured party organization which filter the selection process so that different politicians with different convictions, with different skills get on top, starting from the youth organization, starting within the party lines. So I think my main point is that this intermediation and the challenge that we no longer have political organization in charge of this selection process is leaving a lot of young people with conviction, with interest in politics alone, and the process is kind of messy. Maybe they join a party, but the selection process, because of the disintermediation and the difficulties to have structured organization, is going a little bit in a negative way, to my point of view. There was a lot of, in old parties, there was a lot of comparative advantages exploited, because you have a party, you have a common mission, you have an organization, so you can select the guy in charge of writing the laws, the guy in charge of addressing the crowds with different skills, same mission, same organization. You have a true political elite, a true political class in charge of running a party in the country. Nowadays, this is a little bit lost in the transition, because everybody is alone. You have to tweet, you have to address a crowd, you have to write a law proposal. There is no common mission, there is no way to exploit this comparative advantage. So what I was trying to say in the selection of politicians, what went wrong to me is that we no longer have these tools to select politicians and to let a political class and representative to arise and to do politics, not technocratic tasks.
So thank you, Tommaso. So now I would like to come back to David, and so the idea now is that, okay, we shouldn't abandon representative democracy. Probably we should find something in between. And I would like to know the experience of the assembly in Ireland. But I want to also give you probably another hint for discussion. I think that we are moving. There is some agreement on the fact that we are moving. We need a little bit of both. We need politicians, but we need also kind of direct democracy institution. And one thing that always I'm curious and makes me think is that it's not clear to me that the issue that we decide with direct democracy are really random. Mm-hmm. So if you think about Brexit, so this is something that we arrived to a referendum because the politician decided not to decide, which means that when we're thinking about what we're gonna decide with direct democracy institution, these are gonna be a very selected sample of issue, in particular, and that is my feeling, in which there is a lot of uncertainty of who is gonna be the winner and the loser. And that can create a problem, but this is for
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. I mean, this is, as you know, a huge area, and you only given me 5 minutes, so let me work it.
Get 7.
7? Okay, here we go. let me try it this way. Brexit, because you brought up. I know I mentioned Brexit, but you brought up the Brexit example. People in Britain voted on Brexit. They had no idea what they were voting for. The politicians who had the campaign organised or called the referendum had no idea what they were voting for. They still have no idea what they voted for, right? So that's how direct democracy should never work. Now let me give you the other example. In Ireland in 2018, we voted for abortion. Now that's, for a Catholic country, quite a complex issue, as you might imagine. We had a ban in our constitution. We had a constitutional clause that said the right to life of the unborn was equal to the right to life of the mother. That meant no abortion. And Ireland was roundly condemned by international agencies. And for decade after decade, successive politicians and successive parliaments tried to find a resolution, and they just couldn't do it. So what did they do this time? They set up a citizens' assembly. They got a random selection of 99 citizens picked by a market research company. They put them into a hotel ballroom for 5 months. They weren't there for 5 months, they were there for 5 weekends across 5 months. But they did a lot of reading in between. And their mission was to come forward with a recommendation. Are we going to have a referendum on abortion? If so, what sort of question should be in that referendum? And thirdly, this is the most important thing, what sort of legislation should flow if that referendum goes through? So they spent 5 months coming up with all sorts of details about the circumstances in which abortion should be allowed. And then their report went back to the Parliament. This is where I'm so much in agreement with my colleagues here. It went back to the Parliament, a special parliamentary committee spent 3 or 4 months debating the report of the Citizens' Assembly. It then made recommendations that were virtually the same recommendations as the Citizens' Assembly. The government accepted that there had to be a referendum. The government drafted the legislation that would follow if that referendum went through. The legislation was exactly as the Citizens' Assembly suggested. And then we had the vote. So when the citizens went to vote on abortion, they knew what the question was, and they knew what legislation would follow because they'd actually seen the draft legislation. And they voted for abortion, and exactly that legislation was enacted. So what you had there was a deliberative mini-public involving regular citizens who didn't run, they were representing, to put it this way, disorganized society. 99 people, plucked by a market. So a market research person would knock on your door and say, you're it, you've won the lottery. You're going to come to Dublin and talk about abortion for 5 months. And most times people said no, but eventually they got 99 people randomly selected. But the important thing is they didn't decide. They were not replacing the politicians. They were aiding the politicians in a difficult decision. Can you imagine if they'd done that on Brexit? How different it would have been. And Ireland is not the only place where this is going on. Macron has tried it in France, not very well, but he's tried it also. In the German-speaking community in Belgium, they've just established a permanent Citizens' Assembly. Madrid city government has established a permanent Citizens' Assembly. So there's a growing number of city governments and national governments around the country. The Scottish are now talking about it to deal with their devolution or independence debate. It's definitely coming of age, but I want to keep on repeating the point that it must not be seen as a replacement to our representative institutions. Exactly what you say is what has to survive. And I would see this, and I'm not alone in that, as a help, as a bolt-on, as an addition to help politicians with some difficult issues. I'll stop there.
And would you, so this is happening for any political issues, for particular piece of legislation. So is there any kind of boundary on how the system works?
The Irish experiment is what I call it. It's an experiment. We've had 2 of these. We had a vote on marriage equality in 2015, and that was preceded by a constitutional convention, which was effectively a citizens' assembly. So we've had 2 of these. There's now talk of a 3rd one, maybe, to discuss whether Dublin should have its own elected mayor. But it's still, in the Irish case, very ad hoc. What's interesting in Madrid and in Eupen in East Belgium is that these are now going to be permanent. And when I say permanent, it's not that you have the same 99 citizens. They will rotate the membership, and they will come up with agenda items that might be useful for the politicians, to consider. But the politicians don't have to follow them. They don't have to listen to their advice.
So, going back to Anne, so given your experience in the European Parliament, and given that now we got it clear what we mean as economists for selection of politicians.
I will come back to that.
Please, I want you on this.
Okay, first of all, because I see I could not say comrade because he's a socialist, I'm a Christian Democrat, but my good former colleague Enrique Baron Crespo, he was president of the European Parliament before me, and he was president of the European Parliament during the German reunification process. And I have to speak about Andriotti. I think on Saturday, Andriotti said, I love Germany so much, there should be 2. So anyhow, but this is a different point. But I want, and I think what is necessary in politics, and we sat beside each other as group leaders, and I think Enrique Baron Crespo was always much tougher than myself, but you might see it differently. I think it's necessary to be able in politics that you see in the leader or in the other party not enemies but competitors. And this is what I did not like so much in the Spanish campaign now, in the election campaign, that they were really arguing as if they were enemies. I think you need a basis in a democracy. You have your own position, but you always have to respect the other. And this is my belief: the dignity of the human being is the center of everything what we are doing in personal life and in political life. I would like, Andrea, if you agree, to stress 3 points. I'm sorry, dear member of the Senate, we are colleagues. I'm an honorary member of the European Parliament, so we are colleagues. I have the honor to be a colleague of a senator from Rome. Selection. It's technical and, of course, non-technical. I was asked by somebody in Reims, you know, there where the French kings were crowned. He wanted to become on the list, to become a place on the list of the Macron movement for the European elections. And since there is no real party of Macron, and I'm very happy with Macron, I think the German government should do everything to support him, but I'm against this idea of movements. Movements come and go, and they can very easily switch from the right side to the left side, from the extreme right side to the extreme left side. And so this gentleman of Reims asked me to give a recommendation to the selection committee of the movement of Macron for the Reims region. And I made this recommendation, but he lost, but not because of my recommendation. But you see, if people are not for a longer time in a party and you have a new selection system, it's difficult. And I am an advocate of parties. I don't say the parties are the best things of the world and politicians are good as bad, like priests or teachers or whatsoever. You everywhere have good people and not so good people. But I believe in parties. And in my country, in Germany, and I don't say this must be an example for others, we have an article that the parties have the importance for democracy and are part of the democracy building. My second point, Brexit. We know these fake news, and you have spoken about that. These fake news were part of the result of the referendum. But it started much earlier. And Andrea, you asked me to give my experience. I was chairman of the EPP, European People's Party, and Monica knows it from our time. Chairman of the EPP group, and the ED, European Democrats, that were the British Conservatives. They were, as long as I was chairman of the group from 1999 to 2007, member of our group. And sometimes I always say ironically, my gray and then white hair became a little bit earlier because the British colleagues were in our group. But you can get gray and white hair with Christian Democrats as well. But then Cameron came in 2005, 2006, and we had made, and this is real politics, and we had made an agreement before the European election, 2004, with his predecessor, Michael Howard, that the British should stay in our group after the election. And we gave them concessions. We wrote in our statute of the group, they have the right to have a vice president, they have their own rights in constitutional, institutional question, and so on. And we adopted that. And the French colleagues, I don't know, you remember, Monica, at that time, Enrique, you might have seen it from outside and even you might have liked it, I don't know. One evening, and I misjudged the situation, I wanted to vote that the British get these concessions. The French of our group left the room. This was for the leader of our group a tsunami. That was terrible, because they were not in favor. And then I called Alain Juppé, who was the leader of the party at that time, and he helped that 1 month later the French abstained, and so we got the change of our statute. But I'm coming back to Cameron, and that's why I'm so furious with this man. He said to me when I met him in March 2006, I did not make this commitment. That means that he was not responsible for what we had agreed with his predecessor, Michael Howard. And this type of politicians who think when they arrive on the scene that everything starts with them. And we are living in a continuity. And that's why it's so important to know history. And I said, politics don't start with you. And then finally they stayed in our group until 2009. And he once said to me, yes, but we fulfilled our obligation. No, they would have left the group if they had had the chance to join another group. And there was from Ireland, my good friend Brian Crawley, and he was sharing a group, they called it UEN, you remember, Enrique, Group of Nations. And he told me, I will do everything to keep our group together, that the British don't find an ally, and the Irish did not want the British to have in their own group. So these are all these little things. And so finally they stayed. But what is my point? And this is not something looking back, it's something for the future. Cameron always spoke badly about the European Union. And how can a person, and this is a human dimension, how can a person get trust for something that he criticized all the time? And so Cameron, when he asked to have this referendum, could not expect that the British people would join him, because he always criticized the European Union. And then these fake news were another element, and so finally we got this terrible result, which, and I'm very frank, this is the most disappointing point in my political life, that the British, so difficult they were and are, but we are all difficult, we are all sinners, that they are leaving the European community. And the third point is, I read some days ago, it was the 27th of April, the French newspaper Le Figaro, and it was the 50th day, 50 years day, that the French had made a referendum under President Charles de Gaulle to decentralize France. And some days before, it was in this article, de Gaulle said to some of his party friends of the Gaullists, the French don't want me anymore. So the referendum was on decentralization, but the French did not want to have this great person, with all criticism one might have. They, in the end, they thought 10 years of de Gaulle is enough. So, and then de Gaulle said, when you have a referendum, people very often give an answer to a question which is not asked. So there is a little bit of, not only a little bit of truth in it, it's a lot of truth on it. And so to give an answer to the question of our discussion, I believe in the representative democracy. We can add, of course, some new elements with e-democracy and so on, but I think in the end, it's a person and the truth that has to be in the forefront. So this is my deep belief, and let's not give up our representative system. This is my advice for the future, at least from my poor experience I had in politics. Thank you.
So thank you. I want to leave some time for questions from the audience, but let me first start with one, and then just out of my curiosity. So I'm an economist. As an economist, I'm obsessed with incentives, and so if the idea is, okay, we have representative democracy, but at the same time we should involve citizens more directly and have an interplay between these two parts, is this gonna, in a sense, reduce incentive for politicians to invest in expertise? And this is for both of you.
I mean, it's a huge area. I mean, I agree with what Hans-Gert was saying earlier on about the risks with referendums, that they answer a different question, they kick the government in the backside. That's a serious risk with referendums. So, but referendums are where we are, and you know, referendums are becoming more popular and more common around the world, particularly around Europe. I'm using this as an example, one way of getting at, I think, your question. So for referendums to work, they need to be given the fairest chance, for them to work correctly. And one of the ways you can help them is by giving citizens more input into them. So you know, yes, representative democracy requires our representatives to provide leadership and direction, but equally as our representatives, they need to take direction from their citizens. And the risk of the traditional model of you listening to a group of your fellow citizens who are party members in your constituency, in your district, or you hearing the loudest voices from NGOs and interest groups, is that you get a twisted view of what citizens really want. The alternative is a town hall type meeting, which is the opposite sort of problem, where you get the loudmouths in the room who shout the loudest to influence you in also inappropriate ways. And I do not want to pretend that citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy are magic bullets. But in this instance, they can help. So you can have a process where this random selection of, and with carefully facilitated discussion, listening to experts, hearing from the NGOs and the lobbyists, reflecting, informing themselves, and then with an open mind coming to a view that is then fed back into the representative process for a new piece of legislation or into the direct democracy process for a referendum to occur. I think that's the way I would see it in terms of the representatives allowing a bit of space for citizens, but it has to be done in a coherent way for that to work.
Can take some questions. Please, questions, not long speech. Thanks.
So, a very quick one. So, in this city, for about 1 century and a half, political officers were selected by lot. Okay, so this didn't impede the city to be captured by the Medici family. So that's this was a way to solve Tommaso's agency problem. Okay, why? Because at the time parties didn't exist, and probably the Medicis were the only family that really had a party. So the question for me now is to the politicians. I consider Tommaso your politician side. What will you do to save your own parties? So probably let's say the Christian Democrats and the Socialists are the parties that are really suffering now. So, and I really believe that.
I have a similar question also related to what Tommaso said when he said there is a secular trend that government grows, becomes more sophisticated. And if you think that you need strong parties, you kind of create a class of professional politicians who go to school, in this country to Bocconi, in France to Sciences Po, then they become deputy mayor or speaker for a mayor, assistant mayor, then they become member of parliament, and they never see life outside, and then you use input legitimacy because people know that people in the parliament are different. They've never been real people. They're professional politicians. To what extent do you think that can be changed? Well, you yourself came from real world of academic economists. To what extent you think that can be changed somehow, and what can be done to bring in people who would generate legitimacy? We heard about citizens' assemblies, but we still need parties and politicians, right? So.
Thanks, Monica Baldi, former member association. I'd like to ask the role of media. For instance, I think it's very important. We have a problem next campaign. For instance, we are afraid to have a low number of voters. And not only low number, but even when you said a selection and how to give the information to the citizen, it's very important to know exactly the role of media, and even, not only that, but even the digital platform. If we speak about digital economy, etc., this is very important because, as you know, in the United States, for instance, the role of the social network was very high for determine the election of somebody or somebody else.
Yeah, Jean-Pierre, it's a question to David about the Citizens' Assembly. It seems to me there are two sort of different roles. One is a sort of a better focus group that helps understand what citizens actually think and may help politicians to find out what are the propositions that can actually command some support. Now, there's something else, for example, with climate change, which is actually being dealt with the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland, and France has just decided to create one for climate change. Climate change is something that citizens, they reject some of the measures that are proposed by politicians, politicians know perfectly well that things have to be done, but it's a problem, it's a distributive problem. And how can a citizens' assembly solve this kind of problem? I think it's something different.
Tommaso had one example of direct democracy not being particularly good. John Matsusaka has done a lot of work on direct democracy in the United States. And there he shows that if you compare the outcome of direct democracy from mediated democracy is less captured by the powerful interest than mediated democracy. Now, particularly, I don't know this paper, but the way you describe, if you have an assembly in a small town and you see everybody, etc., of course, the influential people might be overwhelming. But if you have a referendum, in referenda, it seems that they're far from perfect. So speaking about the issue of the environment, for example, in the state of Washington, there was a referendum to try to introduce a gasoline tax, and it failed. However, it failed by a lower margin than it failed in the state and the Senate of Washington, where there is a majority of Democrats. So in a sense, even in that case, the direct democracy does better than the representative democracy.
Is competence something that we still want those who take decision to have or not? This is my first question for the speakers. The second, if we assume that if we think that competence is still relevant, is it better to have a random assembly or politicians that are often selected not on the basis of competence? So which system is better, or are both terrible? This morning we had a session on basic income, and there were data on referenda from Switzerland and simulated referenda, like the surveys that we're having now within the State of the Union, said that there was 60% of people in favor of basic income. But the question was, would you like to receive a basic income of 1,000 euro? And who said no? So the question is, if we want a random assembly to make, or a referendum to make this decision, you have to convey the information. And for example, in the case of basic income, I don't know how I would convey the information on the cost of offering 1,000 euro to everybody. So these are my three questions.
Okay, I try to give a general answer, not referring to one or the other person directly. As far as competence is concerned, of course, politicians need to be competent. And politicians should not only follow the opinion polls of today and tomorrow. And if you follow the opinion polls of today and tomorrow only, one has to take that into consideration, of course. But if you only follow the opinion polls, then you have no convictions and you are lost in the end. And this, in the end, the people will feel. And I give you an example. Konrad Adenauer was certainly somebody who was against Hitler. And he was not a friend of an army. And he said, I'm happy that I never had to carry a weapon. And it was Konrad Adenauer who finally realized, with the division of Europe, with communism, Stalinism, that Germany should be part of the Western Alliance. And so he was in favor of NATO. I think 65% of the German people of Western Germany at that time were against NATO. But he said, we have to do it. And he argued for that. And finally, he convinced his people. And the 15th of September 1957, it was my 12th birthday, that's why I know exactly this date, he got more than 50% of the voting people in Germany, and they supported him. So he went through. Of course, he did other things. He brought 15,000 soldiers in 1955 back from the Soviet Union and so on. But he is an example. Konrad Adenauer, in this case, if you go forward, you can even win something which seems impossible. Then my second point is, and Monica Baldi, you spoke about the challenges to get the voters. I think things change. My party, the Christian Democratic Union, in 2005, when Angela Merkel became, by a very small margin, some thousand votes only, she became the chancellor, and Schröder lost by some thousand votes. And our party had, if I have the figure correctly in my mind, the CDU and CSU, our friends from Bavaria, we together had 35%. And then in the next election, in 2009, we had 42% of the votes, and now we are down to 30%. So if we solve problems, and I think the greatest challenge for all Europeans, not only for Italy, for the Germans, the Spanish, and so on, is the question of asylum and migration. And we have to find a European solution for that and a balance to accept asylum and refugees fleeing from war on the one hand side, and on the other hand side, migration for economic reasons. And we have to find a balance. So, and if we solve these problems, then I think the parties will recover. And it might astonish you now, and my Spanish friends, I don't know whether are political friends from Spain here, but I don't mean now the parties, I mean the principle. I am not so uncontent that the social democrats, I think you say socialists in Spain, that they got a good result. Of course, I would have liked to see my political friends from Partido Popular to win. Of course, this is out of question. And you always have in a political family a position of solidarity. But this example of the election in Spain shows that the social democrats or socialists, as a strong partner of democracy in the European Union, have a chance. And this is my idea, that the government of today can always be or should be the opposition of tomorrow, and the opposition of today can be or should be the government of tomorrow. And that's why it's so important that we have an understanding of democracy, that the different parties and members of the parties are not enemies, but they are competitors serving the same ambition to defend democracy and liberty and our European values.
Well, taking stock a little bit of the discussion, to me it seems that we are converging a little bit towards something that maybe it's obvious from the beginning, that direct democracy and representative democracy should be seen as complements more than substitutes. And this is also going to Luigi's question, that all these comparisons very much depends on the century and on the context and how you exploit these complementarities, because the complementarity can go well or can go really bad. To me, it seems that I'm very sympathetic to the view of Professor Farrell that also representative democracy must be voice-centered, in the sense that you don't include people in the political process only by means of voting, but by means of voice. But the point is how. Because also now in our representative democracy you have a lot of voice, but the point is that not always is referenda is shitstorms on Twitter. So politicians are very much responsive to voice, but voice is kind of incoherent and difficult to keep within the boundaries of an informed public discussion. This is going also to the role of the media and to the role of how we organize and we structure our public discussion. I mean, the abortion example is a great one. This is, of course, the informed and broad discussion that we all would like to see in a political system. But it's really difficult to exploit complementarities to reach that goal. You need not only because we talk a lot about e-democracy, but it's not only an issue to exploit new technologies to have people voting via a smartphone. It's also, you can exploit technology to have e-government, more transparency and more control on elected politicians, or e-participation to exploit public discussion, also not physical public discussion spaces, to have e-participation. So I think that we should invest in all of that, but it's not enough because this complementarity can go wrong. All these e-government, greater transparency, e-participation, more participation of people, it doesn't work to me if the other vertical dimension, the representative part, is not really working, and you don't have some quality of the institutional structure allowing politicians to interact in an effective way with those tools and not in a chaotic and day-by-day way. So I close saying that apart from the use of the term selection, I'm very in line with President Pottering's view that I also love parties more than movements, but because I love parties, I would like not only my party, but all parties to adjust the way they do politics today in these centuries with this instrument, because I think they are losing something. They are not as effective as they were in the past in exploiting all the skills, and I close with Andrea's question. I think that you need competent politicians, but competence is not enough. I think it's just one of multidimensional skills that you need in politics. And so that was my first point, that you need a political organization with a clear message, a common mission, and a coherent organization exploiting all the skills that you need toward that goal and that message. Today, and I'm talking for my party, I don't see neither the message nor the organization able to exploit all the different skills. So a lot of work to do, fascinating work though.
Just two quick things. Can these citizens' assemblies take tough decisions? This has come up in a few of the questions from over there. You know, there's loads of work in the area of deliberative democracy that demonstrates that deliberative mini-publics can take tough decisions. And indeed, in the Irish case, they discussed climate change. The Citizens' Assembly was asked a couple of tasks, a couple of agenda items, and one of them was climate change. And they came out with a very adventurous report that proposed increasing carbon taxes and a number of other measures. That has now gone through the Parliament. The Parliamentary Committee has agreed with a lot of the recommendations, and now we have to see what the government is going to do. So citizens' assemblies can certainly take tough decisions. And so my second point follows on from that. So what? How do we know the citizens' assemblies can actually help, let's say, direct democracy? Because I have been suggesting that it can. Well, we know in the case of the marriage equality referendum in Ireland in 2015 and the abortion referendum in Ireland in 2018, that the citizens' assemblies played an important role in informing the wider voters, because we asked representative samples of voters on referendum day how many of them were aware in terms of answering objective knowledge questions, and the vast bulk of them were aware. And indeed, in the state of Oregon, they have what they call a citizen initiative review, which I think is a rather interesting model that is beginning to be tried in other places. It's a bit like a citizens' assembly, so Oregon is going to have a referendum on a certain matter. They set up a citizen initiative review, and it is given the task to come up with a one-page summary that is giving the positives and the negatives. And then that one-page summary is sent to all the other citizens in the state, and they are informed that this summary was produced by fellow citizens. So it provides an information resource independent of government and independent of NGOs. It's an experiment, and this is what I'm trying to suggest. We're finding new ways of trying to marry representative democracy with new forms of democratic innovation. And that's just one other way you can do it.
Thank you. We have a bit of time for one, max two questions.
So in the context of Brexit, there was a lot of discussion about misinformation in the run-up to the referendum. And now there's discussion about a second referendum, now that people know what could have happened, what would not happen. On the other hand, there's obviously a question, if you have one referendum, you have another referendum, if they come to the same conclusion, come to different conclusions, which outweighs the other. So there's an institutional, constitutional question there. On the other hand, the Swiss Constitutional Court has just cancelled a referendum in Switzerland based on misinformation, as in the Constitutional Court deemed the informational quality in the run-up to the referendum insufficient to make an informed decision in a direct democracy. So the question is, what are the constitutional limits that should exist in more direct or less direct democracies? What about the demos? Can that be the ultimate deciding entity if you have a question about fake news, what have you, lacks of information thereof?
It's actually a follow-up on this, a direct follow-up. Half of my question was this decision by the Swiss court. Actually, there is studies showing that minority rights are consistently sort of in worse condition under direct democracy compared to representative democracy. Studies both in Switzerland and elsewhere with respect to who decides on whether you're going to get a naturalization or generally on citizenship rights show that people are way more likely to be biased on the basis of name differentiations, else equal, than elites, than councils. And as a result, direct democracy has generated, whenever it has been applied, some sort of injustice with respect to citizenship rights, both in Switzerland and elsewhere in Europe. I mean, I'm just asking this as a way of, how should we think about this in the context of direct democracy?
This issue, representative democracy or direct democracy, is important, the electoral system, because the electoral system sometimes give a real representation to people, sometimes no. Being elected 8 times in parliament, 5 times with a preference, 2 times with a uninominal, 1 time with a closed list, I remember that the closed list was really a disaster. Thank you. In Italy, we have in Constitution an article 49 that say that the citizens are free to form parties according to a democratic method in order to contribute to the national politics. Unfortunately, this article had never been applied. I think that if this article should be applied, maybe the direct democracy of the 5-star movement had less power. Thank you.
I'll just give a quick answer to some of the first questions about the referendums and what happens if the result isn't great, or what happens if there's some doubt about the nature of the result or the nature of the process. And I think this is another example of where we're still in an experimental stage. We're constantly innovating. Referendums are becoming more common. And one of the things that is coming out more and more strongly in the study of referendums is the need to have a good, robust architectural structure surrounding the referendum process to try and avoid the sort of risks that the Swiss courts, talk about. We had our version of it during our abortion referendum was it was discovered quite early in the process that very wealthy right-wing American organizations were funding advertising campaigns on Facebook and Google. And Facebook and Google were so embarrassed by this revelation that they themselves banned advertising on their platforms midway through the campaign. The governments haven't come up with an architecture to deal with that. So direct democracy and referendums have to be used very sparingly and very, very carefully. And I'm not convinced we have worked that one out right. We still have to learn how to do it better.
Well, yeah, very briefly on your points. I don't know the Swiss case you mentioned, but it seems to me there are 2 different points to keep in mind. The first one, of course, as we said, it's important to have an informed public discussion leading to the direct decision. Having a technocratic or bureaucratic body decide the threshold of misinformation is scaring me a little bit. If you take that route, and you try to have the public discussion as informed as possible, and then you see what happens. There is another issue, though. Minority rights and the peril of a dictatorship of the majority. I mean, we are discussing about democracy, but we also have an issue of a liberal state and granting minority rights, which is either indirect or representative democracy. We shouldn't, of course, forget that other issue. Last point on the electoral system, when I was mentioning the quality of institution, I was thinking exactly about electoral systems or other institutional features that can improve the quality of the outcome of representative democracy. Electoral systems are a key element on how the party system, we have been talking a lot, whether it evolves in one direction or in another direction, and how, I wouldn't say we select politicians, how we let smart guys to get on top in politics, motivated and guys with conviction. So how we have we get different parties or different politicians very much depends on the quality of institutions, starting from the electoral rule.
Okay, 3 short remarks. First, we have to respect the constitutional orders of the member states of the European Union. If there is a possibility for a referendum, so we have to accept it. And you Irish are very clever. In the first round, you rejected the Lisbon Treaty, and the second round, it was adopted because you got your commissioner. And I will never forget, I was invited to 50 priests in the monastery of Maynooth. There was a cardinal and bishops, and I said, if I were you, I would say yes to the Lisbon Treaty. And in the second round, you accepted it, but not because I went to the priests and to the bishop, but because you got your commissioner and the unanimous vote for taxes, if I remember quite. Second point, what now Tommaso the senator has mentioned, democracy is not everything. Hitler came to power in a democratic way. Okay, Hindenburg, the state president, played his role, but he had not an absolute majority, Hitler, but he had a good majority, and so on a democratic basis, he became chancellor. And then what you just said, the rule of law, step by step, was abandoned, and minorities were not accepted anymore. And so I just want to say that democracy and the legal order always has to be in a good balance, and this is part of our European values. And my third short point is, with all the new social media, which are important, they are an additive instrument, and if they are used in a good way, they are useful. But it's very important that we have a good education system, and that part of our education system in our national states is history. If we forget our history in Europe, everything can be possible in the future again. And I really ask you to do your utmost that history is an important part of the lessons in our school, because if our young generation does not know anything about our past, then everything can happen again. And the unification of Europe, unity in diversity, it has to be done in a good way, I think is something which we have never had in our past on our European continent, and we should do everything to remain good Italians, good Spanish, and German, and so on Europeans, because Europe, the unification of our continent, is the basis that we can defend our values and interests in the world of the 21st century.
So on this high note, we will conclude. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I would like to thank the speakers and the audience. Thanks.
So welcome everybody to this session on capture of politics by business. I am Andrea Ichino, a professor of economics here at the UI. And I was in the scientific committee of the State of the Union. I am responsible for the organization of this session. I would like to thank Oxford University Press and the journal Economic Policy who are sponsoring this session. And you can find some materials on this journal right outside. It's a journal that is trying to transfer economic research to the policy debate, as a little bit the State of the Union is trying to do. This session originally should have featured Sergei Guriev, professor of economics at SoU and the chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, together with Luigi Zingales, professor of economics at Chicago Booth, and an opponent from the world of business. But it was impossible to find one. Nobody wanted to take the challenge of defending business in this debate. So, in some sense, we are missing that, but we have the fortune to have more time for what I think will be a very interesting conversation between Sergei and Luigi, and also time for questions from the audience. So I leave it now to Sergei and Luigi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for arranging this session. Indeed, I can only testify that we tried hard to find people from private sector to participate in this discussion, and we failed. But instead, we are in a very special place. When Luigi talks about those issues, he uses this concept of Medici's vicious circle, and we are sitting here in Villa Salviati, who actually gained wealth and through connections, in particular in Medici's times. We also are sitting right below Medici's coat of arms, and we are sitting in this Sala Stemmi, and this is exactly the stemma of Medici. So it's a very special place to be in, and this is exactly the issue that we are going to talk about. Luigi wrote this paper towards political theory of the firm, and also has written much more in the last several years, many years. Even we can probably date back to the book with Raghurajan, Saving Capitalism from Capitalists. And I think this Medici's vicious circle concept captures the issue of capture probably best. And let's start with what Luigi thinks Medici's vicious circle is and why this matters for the future of democracy.
So thank you very much, Sergei. Thanks, Andrea, for inviting me. And I think the idea is very simple. In a sense, we know that business can be influential in the political arena. The only, if you want, novel point I make, if there is any novel point, is that I see this influence not only more likely, but also more necessary, the more concentrated the business is, and the more the business is tend to toward a monopoly situation. And why? Because it's not in a country where open bribes are not possible, and now in Italy there are still a lot of open bribes, so maybe this is not the perfect place to discuss. But in the United States, the envelope full of cash are relatively rare. They do exist, but they're relatively rare. They do it with more tact. And generally, the way you sort of get your influence is by promising future jobs. And those promises are valid only under two conditions. Number one, you are still around. My favorite example of a silly company is Chuck E. Cheese. That does things for kids. If you're Chuck E. Cheese, you cannot promise jobs to regulators in the future because, or you can, but it's not sure that they believe you because you might not be around, okay? So that's number one. Number two, it's not easy for Chuck E. Cheese to reserve like a important position at a high salary for somebody contributing nothing to the company. Why? Because at the end of the day, really cuts into profits and efficiency and so on and so forth. If you're Citigroup, you can create a chairmanship position, no executive, $10 million a year, and give it to a politician, and they don't notice the difference. So I think that on the one hand, the more oligopolistic a market is, the easier it is for the people earning those rents to capture the political system. But also, and this is the other interesting twist, is if you live in an oligopolistic market or in a market that earns rents, for example, because of natural resources, you kind of have to capture the government because otherwise the government will capture you. And it says, if you have a lot of rents that can easily be appropriated, think about oil companies. If you are a country full of oil, whoever controls the oil makes a lot of money and is very risky for the private sector to be really owning oil and not controlling the government. Why? Because the temptation of the government to actually gain power in that sector, even expropriate, like happened in many Latin American countries, is very, very large. And so if you have a very concentrated and monopolistic economy, business either controls the government or is controlled by the government. There is nothing in between. And this really comes to mind the country where you come from, with a few oligarchs. Either the oligarchs own Yeltsin or Putin owns the oligarch. In fact, it's one of those. So I think that there is nothing in between. Why? Because it's very hard to maintain this sort of balance in a country very highly concentrated. And so the reason why I use the Medici as an example is because the Medici made their money in a sector that was at the time relatively competitive, like banking. But unlike the Peruzzi and Bardi that lost everything by making the wrong decision to land, they made the right decision from the family point of view to invest in politics. And unlike the Peruzzi and Bardi that were long gone, they stay in business for more than 300 years, thanks to the rents that they were conquering through the control of the city of Florence. Another point that a colleague mentioned, and I think that in the next iteration I will add this, which is also important, there is a third important element in this trinity of power. There is the economic power, there's the political power, there is the ideological or religious power. And of course, the Medici control that as well. So I think that the most powerful and stable system is a system that really concentrate all the three in one hand. Think about the Egyptian pharaoh. The Egyptian pharaoh owns the land, so all economic power, was the head of state, and was the son of God and controlled the church. Once you have all these three, you can last 2,000 or 3,000 years straight.
Unfortunately, you still have sometimes rely on your successors. It's really not one person, whatever the gods tell you. I would just like to go back to what Medici's vicious circle actually is, because not everybody in the room seems to have read your paper.
Unbelievable. Is that possible?
So Luigi claims, referring to secondary sources, that Medici's motto was money to get power and power to protect money. This is not what Wikipedia says, by the way. Wikipedia believes that Medici said festina lente, so hurry up in a slow way, something like this, right? And yet, I think this beauty of this bipartite system, a circular economy, if you like, is you capture politics, that helps you to protect your rents, and then you use rents to capture even more political powers. Which brings me back to your point about monopoly rents and oil rents. The problem today is you have this rise of superstar firms. And both globalization and technological progress create projects which initially look like competitive industries, competitive businesses, and then become transnational super monopolies, because you have huge returns to scale once you work in the global market, once you come to the new markets, and so you end up with these big tech companies, but also multinationals. You mentioned Citi in financial sector, in entertainment sector. So in principle, you create oil country out of Silicon Valley in your terms. So to what extent do you think this is an issue, and to what extent this is what drives the rise of marriages in modern United States?
The economist said that data is the new oil.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you're absolutely right. And there is a second sense in which this is right, is the ownership of those data is a lot in doubt. Is sort of is not something that we all understand what it means to own a piece of land. What it means to own the data and who owns the data is a political decision that is made differently in the European Union and in the United States. And as such, political decision is a very subject to political pressure. And so now we are going through a phase in which there is a lot of attack to the big tech companies. But let's go back a couple of years ago, before Trump was elected president, and those companies own the country. And it says Google had 451 employees that moved from Google to the White House under Obama. What everybody says, terrible that Cambridge Analytica did this thing to make Trump win. Obama did the same with Google and was considered very cool at the time. Why? Because it was Obama. Executive of Google's met with the Obama administration 251 times, including, I think that 37 meetings, short meetings with the president. And now we know from an economic paper that every time you meet the president, your stock price goes up. And so meeting 37 times is very, very valuable. So I think that there was a perfect integration. Now, this perfect integration has been broken by accident, that Trump was elected, and that Trump basically is at odds with these people. And we are very lucky, because I think that if there wasn't like some other issue that divide them, I think that Trump would make a very effective case of defending these monopolies against any form of regulation. These monopolies are very difficult to regulate because, you know, in the United States where regulation was invented, the first monopoly was regulated was the railways. And why was it regulated? Because people protested for high prices. Actually, Illinois, where I live, is one of the first places where there was a regulation of the railways because the farmers were upset that they were working hard the entire year, and then who was getting all the profits of their work was the railway monopoly that was transporting the grain. And that led to regulation of the railways. Now, do you really think there is demand for regulating Google and Facebook? People love Google and Facebook because they get the stuff for free. And so there is no pressure whatsoever, no interest to regulate. And the moment we're going to have a president like Trump that is more friendly with the Silicon Valley, we are completely screwed because they will solidify this Medici vicious circle. And the difference, and I always say that to America, at least the Medici left behind all the beauties of Florence. I doubt that Mark Zuckerberg will leave anything worth remembering in the future.
That's a good point. So people would usually say if you get stuff for free, then you yourself become a commodity. In this case, your data become a commodity, if you like. Do you think that there is a growing realization that these companies have to be regulated despite they are providing such great goodies for free to people? There is more and more a backlash, including because of Trump, Cambridge Analytica, and so on.
Okay, so let me give you a little plug here. In 2 weeks, the 15th and 16th of May, at Chicago, the Stigler Center organized a conference exactly on this topic, where we are going to come with some early proposals of how to regulate it, and all this could be seen in streaming, so you don't need to come to America to see it.
Thanks to big tech.
And thanks to technology in general, I think that. So I think that there is at least a discussion that is starting in academia and in small political circle about this. Whether this represents a large movement, I doubt. Honestly, I think that the test is Elizabeth Warren has come up with a very detailed proposal. You might like it, you might not like it. However, is a serious proposal on the table. And I want to see how many of the other Democratic candidates will go down the path and make a proposal. So do you think that Kamala Harris, who represents California, will do that? Do you think that Joe Biden, who just said very explicitly that these billionaires are not so bad, you have to love them, is going to make a proposal like that? And I can go down the list. Right. And I don't even think that Bernie Sanders has a clear proposal. So I don't think that we're there yet, but the good news is 2 years ago we're in a war situation, so one step at a time.
Right. So what would be the key elements in a proposal for you to be deserving your attention? Breaking up Google or Microsoft, or say Microsoft or Facebook, or yeah?
So I think that first of all, I don't want to reveal in advance all the areas of proposal, but let me give you, first of all...
Do you like European regulation? I
think that, first of all, I don't think that we should do generous and treat everybody the same. So I believe that when it comes to social media, interoperability, and which is a fancy name for, say, promote competition, is the solution, okay? I tell you a little story. There was in California a little company called Power Ventures that was managing your social media. So you could give to Power Venture the password for Facebook, at the time MySpace, and maybe Twitter, and or Instagram. I don't think Instagram was around there, but anyway, you get the point. And they will manage all your social media, to do the post on all the places, and to aggregate all the messages from the social media. So in a sense, was the ideal thing. Facebook went after Power Venture, saying that if I give to you my login and password and you come with my permission into my Facebook page, you are a hacker, you have to go to jail. Okay? Wow. And why? This is to make interoperability as difficult as possible. So I am of the view, this is a very, since we're in Italy, a Naudi view of competition, not a very American view of competition, that competition must be defended every day. There is a sentence by Einaudi which is beautiful and say, you have to level the daily trenches the business put behind to protect their interest. Okay? So that is the notion of the role of the state and the role of antitrust. So number one thing, I would like more interoperability. Number two, most people don't know. What is the difference between a newspaper and Facebook? The big difference is that Facebook has an exemption. The Telecommunication Act of 1996, when Facebook did not exist yet, but internet companies started to arise, said that internet companies are exempt from any liability for what they transmit or post. Okay? And as a result, if I write a newspaper and I report that a bunch of Rohingya are killing my kids and this is false, I face liability. But if I post or I repeat a post that says that and I'm Facebook, I have zero liability. Now, can even understand that if I am WhatsApp, which still belong to Facebook, but at least I don't do any editing. But in Facebook, I do edit stuff. So if you are writing a reasonable news, and after you're writing a inflammatory news, I will pick the inflammatory news. Why? Because that maximizes my profit. So I know that people are attracted by what is weird, extreme, violent, and sexy. And so my editorial policy, not that Facebook is not a media, is a media, and the media in which the editorial policy is designed to make you addicted to the screen. So the worst form of editing possible, and they have zero responsibility. So in Myanmar, hundreds of thousands of Rohingya were killed as a result of this thing, and Facebook faced zero responsibility. So it seems to me that introducing some responsibility is a no-brainer. So I want to start from the low-hanging fruit. I'm not saying we should break up the search algorithm of Google, which, by the way, is very efficient. I don't know why Google owns YouTube, but I think I could see a breaking up there. But I think that there are so many low-hanging fruit that going for the big ones ensures that nothing gets done.
Right. It's, you remember 20 years ago, there was a case against Microsoft breaking it up vertically, exactly for those reasons, where Microsoft owned both operating system and applications and abused, well, allegedly abused market power in the browser market. Right. So in principle, you can bring up arguments like this for
No, not only you can, but people might forget how useful that antitrust suit was. Many people say the real remedy was the legal case, not the remedy. The remedy eventually, part of for political pressure, but ended up being a joke. But the exposure that this brought to the world really slow down Microsoft in its desire to monopolize the internet. In the sense, people don't remember that at the time there was a plan that was discovered through discovery in the trial of charging a fee for every transaction on the internet. Okay, that was Microsoft's model. And if we didn't have the antitrust suit, I think that model would have prevailed. So my view is that antitrust are good to let new startups come around. Google and Facebook would have never exploded in the way they did if it wasn't for the fact that Microsoft was under an antitrust investigation. So now is the turn of Facebook and Google.
Since I'm here to play the devil's advocate, I would tell you that Microsoft at that point would say that's the only way to fight spam emails. So you need to charge very little, very small amount for every email you send or receive. That helps to fight spam. So there is always an argument for something like this. But on liabilities issue, there is actually a major effort by those companies to stop this change. They are very much aware of the attempts to make platforms liable, and they say it's a fight against freedom of speech.
Yeah, no, actually, and it's interesting because within the various committees that will report this, we have a discussion, and some people are exactly making that argument and saying, I'm sympathetic to the fact you don't want to give to a monopolist the right to do editorial work because you are afraid of censorship. Yeah. I'm sympathetic to that, except for the fact that lifting their liability is not preventing them from doing editorial job. Right. It's just taking away the liability when they do it. They do editorial job. We just heard in the previous session that when they choose, they stop campaigns. So the campaign against abortion, they stop it. Why? Because they didn't like it. In Brazil, they stopped the WhatsApp messages of Bolsonaro. Why? Because they don't like Bolsonaro. Now, I don't like Bolsonaro, and my first vote was cast in favor of abortion in Italy. So I'm not trying to defend the other position. I'm trying to say that it's very dangerous to leave to two guys, Google and Facebook CEO, all this regulatory power. Since one day they decided, we don't want to advertise cryptocurrencies. Now, maybe it was the right decision, but who are they to make regulatory decisions for the vast majority of the American people? That's crazy. And the way you undermine this is by making stuff more competitive, and interoperability is one. But maybe breaking up WhatsApp from Facebook is a good idea.
So let me ask a question about antitrust regulation, which you rightly remind us was actually originated in the US and came from the US. And when we teach antitrust regulation, we always go back to Sherman Act and so on. Today, it looks like antitrust regulation in Europe is stronger than in the US. Why is that? Why do you think that is the case?
So I think that things go historically in a pendulum. So for those of you who are not so familiar, since you're not familiar with my paper, I for sure you're not familiar with antitrust regulation. So going back in 1890, the Sherman Act was passed, ironically, the same year in which the Principle of Economics by Marshall was published. I doubt that the American legislators knew the book, especially because it was published in England, so it takes some time. So long story short, the evil of monopolies as we describe them today were not understood by the legislators. Their point was much simpler, and to some extent, I know that in Italy has a negative connotation, but in American sense, was a populist measure, was to say we want to rebalance the power. Think about the railways. The railways are too powerful against the farmers, and antitrust is about fighting concentration of power. And the old tradition of antitrust that Louis Brandeis picked up, etc., it say you can either have concentrated ownership or democracy. You cannot have the two at the same time. Concentration of economic power is basically bad for democracy. And this idea, irony of this, was carried by the American troops throughout the world. When they arrived in Japan, the first thing they did is they broke down the zaibatsu. Why? Because the concentration was responsible for the rise of the Nationalist Party in Japan and the war. When they arrived in Germany, they broke down the cartels. Why? Because the cartel contributed to the rise of Hitler. So the United States exported the Brandeisian view of the world to the rest of their view of the world to the rest of the world. Ironically, in a sense, and this kept going, and the United States, the 50s and 60s were a year of very strong antitrust enforcement in the United States. I think that a couple of things happened. One is possibly they went too far, in a sense, the extreme decisions were that if you have 7% market share in a market, you are considered having market power, we don't allow it to merge.
But that depends on definition of market power.
I understand, but the fact that it was supreme in a famous decision, the Philadelphia National Bank, they were obtained 12% market power because it's too much. They didn't allow the merger. So I think that they were very extreme in that dimension. And so I think that a school that originated where I teach, the Chicago School, started to trying to bring things to the middle and say, look, I think we went too far. We need to see the efficiency consequences of our antitrust. And we are also worried about abuses of power. If antitrust is too loose, not very clearly specified, it subjects itself to political abuses. And remember, we're at a time where Nixon was using the IRS against his political enemies. So if you can use the IRS against your political enemies, IRS is a tax authority. Imagine how can you use other stuff. And so they came down to say the role of the antitrust is only to analyze that you make sure that you don't have waste due to monopoly for people in the field, the Harbinger triangle. Okay, there is a deadweight loss of monopoly. We need to fix the deadweight loss of monopoly. That's the only purpose of antitrust. And this basically narrowed down the antitrust job tremendously to the point to make it irrelevant. Because at the same time, there was a vast amount of literature that made it more and more difficult to prove that there was any harm, because economists are very clever. They can build any model and say that potentially there could be a benefit, and if this, that, and in an American system, and this is one of the big differences, in the American system, you cannot make a decision and the company sues you. You have to take the decision in front of a judge and get the permission. And because the first move is subject to a judicial review, you have to prove harm. And if the other side, which has, of course, the best consultants, the best lawyers, etc., it's enough to throw the benefit of the doubt and say maybe there is a possible state on the world in which this doesn't harm consumer, end of the story, that's, of course, paralyzing the antitrust.
But then today, of course, it's much harder to prove waste, the deadweight loss of monopoly, because monopolies are actually achieving greater efficiencies. We are talking about sectors where you don't have diminishing returns to scale, like in Harbinger triangle. vice versa. Bigger Google is better Google in economic terms. Multinational company is more efficient company. And that's where Europeans are criticized. They're told, look, you just don't have Googles. That's why you regulate Google. You don't have Apple. That's why you tax Apple. If you had your own Google, you would not object against the mergers. And this is exactly what we have right now with this Alstom-Siemens merger debate, where politicians say, we want to have our own Google. We don't have that big tech, but at least we have Alstom and Siemens. Let's build our own national champion. Luckily, DJ Combe, or unluckily, DJ Combe stands up to that.
No, but you brought a perfect example. It's just I was very happy of the decision about Siemens and Alstom for two reasons. First of all, because as an economist, I think it was the right decision. But even more importantly, because dismisses the point that Americans do all the time, that the Europeans do it out of envy. And I actually turn around the point and say, no, it's not that they do it out of envy, it's they do it because they're not completely captured. In a sense, that's the right decision, and they can do the right decision because they don't have the political pressure. Now, they try to do the right decision also with Armstrong and Siemens. Let's see whether it stands, because we see that whenever they do the right decision with local companies, there is an enormous amount of political pressure in the opposite direction. They don't face this political pressure with Google and Facebook because they're not sort of local. But the other point you make is also very important, is these companies operate in a sector that is dramatically different than the sectors that we're used to. And so, in a sense, this requires us to rethink antitrust. That's the reason why I organized this conference, in order to, number one, rethink the traditional antitrust. Now, I want to do more, which is going to be controversial, because in addition to rethink the traditional antitrust, I want to bring back the Brandeisian approach to antitrust that I think should be separate from the standard antitrust, but is important, especially when it comes to media. And there is an example of this approach in the UK, where they talk about citizens' welfare. In a sense, if you have the cheapest news, that's not enough. You want to have diverse news, okay? For democracy, it's important to have diverse news. So treating news, and I quote here, like a toaster. A famous FCC director in the United States said that TV is just a toaster with images. Why? He said, okay, if I know how to do antitrust, I know that antitrust for TV. Is wrong, because TV is not just a toaster with images, is a medium of communication, and as such should be subject to different rules. After all, in the United States, there is an antitrust and there is an FCC, Federal Communication Commission, for the radio and the TV. So I think we need a digital authority that treats this in a separate way.
That's exactly the conclusion of this famous report led actually by Obama's ex-Obama's chair of Council of Economic Advisor, Jason Furman, for the UK, where they say that in digital era, competition policy, antitrust policy should be specially designed and considered. But I'm glad you brought us to media, because I think this Medici story of politics and business is incomplete in today's world, because, as you rightly said, you want to also influence people's minds, not only seats in parliaments. And we are in the country where a great innovator of that system, Berlusconi, came up with the idea that if you own media, that can help you to influence politics and therefore influence regulation, and then get more money and fund more media acquisitions and subsidization and so on. And in the UK, the analog would be Rupert Murdoch, who famously said, I want to say something about the EU, something good about State of the Union, so let me quote Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch said, I really don't like EU. When I come to Downing Street, I tell them to do this, and they do this. In Brussels, I don't even know whom to talk to. So he's very unhappy. He's very unhappy about the State of the Union, which in your world would probably would be something that makes us happy. But overall, I'm thinking that this Medici circle about political influence is now operating now through different channels as well. Media, universities, think tanks, you mentioned experts and lawyers. To what extent you think this is a challenge? To what extent you think this Medici vicious circle is not only about promising jobs to politicians, but also through owning media, through influencing academics, through philanthropy?
So I'm going to make Andrea happy because, you know, Andrea and I were in graduate school together. He's much older than me, but we were overlapping in Cambridge. And at the time, Andrea was super leftist, and I was very conservative. And now we're flipped. But I'm not super lefty, but I'm to the left of him. But at the time, but it's very useful. But growing up in Italy, you are exposed, especially in the 70s and early 80s, you are exposed to certain things. Then you go to America, and the world is completely different. And in the 70s and 80s, people complained that the university were completely dominated by business in Italy. And the reality is, they didn't have a dime from business. And many universities say, we would like to have a little bit more money, honestly. If they were a little bit more generous, that would make a difference. Now, fast forward 30 years and look at the United States, I think that most of us academics are not aware of how much business influence academic research. And actually, economics is not the worst field. You go to other fields, and it's much, much worse. So I wrote a little paper about a case of pollution, where DuPont dumped some substance. Actually, you should listen to it because the Veneto is full of this substance. It's called PFOA, and it's something that accumulates in your body. Now, we didn't used to have it. Now 99.7% of Americans have it, and probably of Italians as well. And it generates nice things like kidney cancer, testicular cancer, and a number of these things, okay? Now, this was a very sort of a strange substance. It's used to produce Teflon and stuff like that. And it's also used in military stuff to produce anti-inflammatory whatever. This substance was pretty unknown, and all the research was done by DuPont. And then the story, and we were not fully able to confirm this fact because the editor of this review died, but there was one guy who published, who submitted and got accepted a paper saying that the PFOA was dangerous, okay? And then presented at the conference, somebody from DuPont are at the conference, and they're very surprised this paper has been accepted in a journal. And then, we don't know the nexus of causality, then the editorial board of this journal is taken over, changed completely, and this paper is disinvited and not published, okay? And I thought this was an exception. Then I read a book about glyphosate, that is a pesticide produced by Monsanto. And in that book, there is an identical story. So they try to publish a paper against glyphosate, so the glyphosate is dangerous. It gets accepted. Monsanto knows. They go, they change the board, they disinvite the paper, end of story. Few years ago. It's not like a long time ago. And then you realize that this is quite common. I have a quote of a medical journal that say we cannot accept this paper because it is against our advertising policy. Okay, so this is a scientific journal that cannot accept the paper because it speaks against some of the advertising in the medical journal. So this is, and then we are surprised that people don't trust experts. People don't trust experts because actually understand that experts should not be trusted. Because at the end of the day, and not all of them, of course, people generalize, etc. But unless we do a major cleaning on that front, I think we're not going to go anywhere. And so, for example, not to plug again, but the conference I organized, I put as a requirement that anybody involved in doing this research and presenting this stuff should not have worked in favor or against Google or Facebook in the last 2 years, okay? And you'll be surprised how many academics were cut out of this. Because basically everybody, in one way or another, has a grant from Google, has a work at Facebook, blah, 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 and so...
And we got data from Facebook. This is actually very important. We need data. We have this exclusive relationship, so we benefit from having access to something which is indeed new oil for our own production function.
So one of the papers that I'm most proud of that was published in a book, because I think I never submitted, but I was sure that no journal will ever accept it, is called Preventing Economist Capture. And in there, I make it very clear at this point that people are not fully aware of, but I think is very important for 2 reasons I will explain. The issue of selection and publication of results as a function of control over data. Okay? So even if you follow all the academic rule, and the academic rule is, imagine you have Facebook and I want to do some research. The academic rules say that you cannot screen my results. Okay, so if you allow me to do the work, then you don't like the result, tough luck, you cannot prevent me from publishing ex post. Okay, this is in principle what should happen. Now, notice that even the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States does not follow this rule. Okay, because there is a person that needs to censor the articles. And one guy said, oh, but this never happens. I said, wait a second. You're an economist. You understand in equilibrium, nobody gets rejected, but the fact that there is a guy in charge of screening has implication ex ante, okay? And there is at least one paper that was screened by a Fed in New York. Anyway, but so number one, even if I follow all the rules, first, Facebook will only allow me to research things that they want to research. So now Facebook is opening up some data, but they said you cannot research the 2016 elections. Okay? They say openly, at least in this case it's open that they cannot. Two, and here Facebook and others are trying to improve, two, they're going to pick the person that is going to do the research. So if I am famous for writing articles criticizing companies, do you think they're going to allow me to write a paper about anything with any data? The answer is no.
Have you tried?
I try, actually, I've done it better. At some point, I was a consultant for the PCAOB. Now, nobody here knows what the PCAOB is. The monitor of the auditors, the auditors of the auditors.
Yeah.
In an agency in the United States, they're supposed to audit the auditors. And they have fantastic data on the auditors. And in the United States, until recently, the identity of the person signing the audit report was covered. So you knew that PwC or EY signed the report, but not that Luigi Zingale signed the report. Mm-hmm. And so I said, oh, because you have all this data to do this, I want to do a study to see, because you keep this identity closed, I want to know whether people who made major mistakes suffer consequences in this internal labor market or not. So if you were the auditor of Lehman and you didn't raise the flag of the famous Repo 105, or if you were the auditor of Colonial Bank that now settled for billions because, do you go about doing your career normally, or you are expelled from the system? Because we hope that in an open market this works, but if you keep this closed and nobody knows, we want to know whether this works. It seems like very germane to the purpose of the institution.
It's actually good for them.
It's good for them.
It makes business case for them.
Ironically, I was a consultant for the organization, so I wasn't even an outsider. Mm-hmm. The answer was no, and my consulting job was terminated.
I'll give you one observation. In our chief economist world, we highly respect the president of the World Bank, David Malpass. So his last job in the private sector, he was chief economist of Bear Stearns. Mm-hmm. So he didn't suffer much. So he's now running the World Bank.
As a chief economist of Bear Stearns, I'm not so sure you are responsible.
You don't have responsibility. You just make calls on macroeconomic scenarios. Yeah. Anyway, so we now have come to a stage where we have time for questions. We would like to open up floor for questions. We have microphones. Can we get a mic? There is a gentleman there. Yeah. Oh, there. Yeah, you need to raise your hand. Yeah. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, hello. Hi, my name is Stefan. As a chief executive of a much smaller public company than Facebook or Google, I agree with a lot of what you say, but I object to the name capture of politics by business, because as you do sometimes do, you need to differentiate size of business and type of market. And the sorts of things you're talking about really apply only to the very large, the really giants in certain specific industries. And in almost all other areas, businesses like mine are like any other group, including institutions, academic, and so on, that try to some degree defend themselves against other forces. So where in your anatomy of capitalism do you distinguish between what is appropriate attempt to influence your world and what is, in fact, this very different world of really being a superpower business?
Oh, first of all, absolutely. And I was actually yesterday teaching a class on lobbying to my students, and I was reporting some quotes. And what is interesting is a form of lobbying is protected by the First Amendment in the United States. And they say clearly that it is a right of individual and, of course, of businesses to address the government when they have a grievance. And I didn't notice that until I was teaching yesterday, say, actually, that's a right definition. I want the right to complain when the government does things against me. That's kind of the good lobbying. And then, in my list of quotes, there was a quote of the Supreme Court in 1875 that was saying that if any business were to lobby to have a special favor, etc., this would be sort of terrible for the business, infamous for the community, everything terrible. So basically, long story short, I think that the lobbying that is done to protect yourself against the public administration, what they do wrong, is sacrosanct and even defended by the First Amendment in the United States, but I think it is the right lobbying. And I call the lobbying to get the government off your back. The lobbying to get the government in your pockets, that's the dangerous one, the one you have to limit. And now, I don't know what company you're running, but most small companies don't have that power. Now, there are some cases in which, for a number of coincidences, even smaller organization can be pretty powerful. In the sense, it's
initially small. Once you have government in your pocket, you suddenly start to grow.
Yeah, but think about the power of the NRA. They have a lot of followers, but the power of the NRA is disproportionate vis-a-vis even their followings, okay? Since we are in Tuscany, I cannot sort of fail to mention that the power of the cooperative banks here, the Banche Popolari, in all Italy, was disproportionate with respect to their size. Why? Because they were very well connected, integrated with the political system. Some people say even with masonry, I don't know, but anyway. So they also. So I'm not prepared to say that only super large business is to blame. However, I think, and I'm thinking along these lines, and I want to come with some new ideas, but I think that large business is disproportionately the problem here, and the one we need to guard against, to the point of making different rules for larger business. Because I think that the Medici vicious circle only applies to companies that are so large that they can really offer a lot on the other side of the table. And I don't know if you were here before, but Chuck E. Cheese cannot.
Yes. There was a question back there.
There is a lady in front. Why
yes,
don't you ask a lady in front?
We'll ask a lady. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, microphone. Please take the microphone.
Okay, good.
Yeah. You're definitely next. Yes.
So this conversation seemed to be mostly directed at political communication. So I want to go actually, in fact, to the roots of big business relations with politics, and about a case that Sergey is very familiar with. So similar to what Luigi was saying about Americans doing what they did in Japan, they smashed the big business so that they could run a new political regime. The same thing happened in Russia after 1992. So Gaidar and Yeltsin and others, they wanted to smash it so bad and so fast, the big business, whatever, the state big business, that it could never be rebuilt again. I think that was probably the goal of the shock therapy, right? But then, interestingly enough, in a few years, maybe in 4 years, we had loans for shares and the kind of intervention of big business in the new Russian democracy, right? So it somehow morphed to something very different. So the question that I have for you, and I think it is important because it goes down to this idea of democratization as an intra-elite process as opposed to a masses versus the elite phenomenon, right? So it's an important question. How did it actually advance in Russia, where the Russian politicians actually were directing resources in early 1990s to attract support from the regions? Or was it like, as Treisman and others said, it was without any maps? Or was it actually a smart way of spending from big business, state business, and getting support? And how does it teach us about the relation between big business and politics?
Thank you. I think my question is very much related to what Luigi was starting with about the role of rents and oil and so on. I should clarify that in 1992, Russia didn't have business. So Russia moved from Soviet system to market system. However, what you have in mind did happen in the sense that the new government wanted to take assets away from managers who pretty much privatized that in a non-transparent, have not privatized it, but got control. And basically their idea was we take it away from old elite and privatize, and the new private owners will ask for more and more reforms. And this is where the problem comes. Unless you have strong political institutions, you have this problem of Medici. You give an oil firm to one new guy, and this new guy believes that he doesn't need rule of law. He doesn't need political checks and balances because he's doing so well without political checks and balances. And that's exactly what happened. So you need to privatize in a more transparent way, in a competitive way. You try to, when you privatize, you want to take away the rent. So, and you want to create competition, which means open up to foreign owners, foreign investment, so on. This is exactly what not happened. And today, your question is how to do it differently. Today, we are facing this issue in some of our countries. Ukraine is in a very similar situation like Russia in the 1990s. Uzbekistan is like Soviet Union in the 80s. So we are thinking about those issues, and the answer is you run this risk of creating oligarchy, and you need to privatize in the right way, at the right moment. For example, today in Ukraine, we are in favor of small-scale privatization, but we say until you run parliamentary elections and foreign owners want to participate in privatizations, you should not privatize large assets. Why? Because foreign owners, foreign direct investment will not come until political stability. And that means that oligarchs will get those assets at a reasonably low price, and you'll get, again, in this vicious circle of oligarchy controlling business and politics. So these are the issues that are very salient in all countries, but in Russia, they're aggravated by this oil issue. In Ukraine, a little bit like that as well, because in Ukraine, instead of oil, you have coal, steel, pipes, and so on, and oligarchs are exactly in those industries where you have rent. And then, of course, every single TV media channel is owned by an oligarch. And so that is exactly the Medici vicious circle today in Ukraine. How to make sure that politicians and media are independent of business and vice versa. And this is what presidential election did, maybe. A person running on a campaign, I'm against corruption, against oligarchs, I'm new, I'm not part of the incumbent elite, I'm coming to the office. And he was elected on this platform. The problem, of course, is that many people say that he is a puppet of one of the oligarchs owning this media channel, where this person actually created and ran his media business, his TV series, and so on. So these are very life challenges, as you rightly said. I wrote a paper about that episode of Russian history. Journal Economic Literature came out a couple of months ago. It's a survey of a book about Gorbachev, but it also talks a lot about those issues, about interest groups before reforms, after reforms, and so on.
So I have not read your paper, I will read it, but I want to ask you, since you're an expert in that, because my impression is that part of the problem is that unlike the American troops that came in 1945, that were impregnated of Brandeisian ideas, the academics that went from the United States to advise Soviet Union and Russia were not impregnated of Brandeisian idea. They thought actually that concentrated ownership was good for incentives. And they completely miss the risk that concentrated ownership might be good for incentives, but is terrible for democracy.
Yeah,
Am I wrong in this?
Yeah, I think when I read what those academics wrote in early 1990s, I'm actually impressed that they do talk about those challenges and importance of institutional reform, rule of law, checks and balances, and so on, much more than people think. But you're right that concentrated ownership was praised for incentives in terms of separation of ownership and control. And we see that Russian companies run by oligarchs with concentrated ownership in technical terms, in efficiency terms, in investment terms did better. But as you rightly said, in terms of corruption, you had all the problems you described. One country I would like to mention from 1990, since you mentioned Japan, one interesting country is Korea. So Korea did have concentrated ownership, did have interconnected political economic relations. And then in 1998, that system went bankrupt during the crisis. And then instead of troops, IMF came in. IMF came in and said, we need antitrust regulation. We need to reduce entry barriers. We need to break collusion between banks and companies. And then the Korean policymakers said, yes, we have this plan. We couldn't put this plan on paper because of this capture. But now when the system is bankrupt, we finally can put it on paper and implement it. And actually with Philippe Aguillon, we are now writing a paper showing that it did have a pro-competitive effect. There was increase in entry, in innovation. Modern post-industrial Korea is to a great extent to that American troops, well, in that case, IMF bureaucrats who brought in this change. Your question finally, sorry. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I'm Chiara Sant'Antonio. I'm a PhD here at the Econ department. And it was very fascinating to hear your takes indeed on capture of politics by business. And we have discussed extensively on the role of media. We have mentioned Siemens. But I was wondering, and I apologize if it's very general, what is your take in terms of, and what are your suggestions into when it comes to big pharma? You were mentioning, which I believe is another very important area of business in which this is particularly relevant, and you were mentioning before Senator Warren being the only one going after the big tech. It seems that even Bernie Sanders is the only one trying to go down, and I was wondering what is your take on it?
I think that the healthcare sector in the United States is an absolute mess. So it's not just pharma, it's an entire sector. We spend almost twice as much as every other country with outcomes that are possibly worse than the rest. So, and there is a picture that I've seen from a paper that is pretty amazing. It says, because you might say the reason why the sort of life expectancy in the United States is so low is because in the United States we eat butter and we have guns rather than eating olive oil and not having guns. But the interesting thing, and of course these things might matter, but the interesting thing is if you look at variation over time of countries, you see that every country in the developed world that increase expenditure on healthcare per capita, they have substantial gain in life expectancy, and basically all of them are within a bound. The United States are like this. So we increase amount of, and we don't. So lots of problems. I think that one very simple step, I don't think that solves everything, but one very simple step is to introduce economic criteria in the passage of license or patent for pharmaceutical, which my understanding exists in the UK, but not exists in the United States. So Today, you get a license if you can prove that your stuff is better than a placebo and doesn't kill you, okay? Provided that you get a license. Not if it is better than a generic drug available in the marketplace. So there is a very widespread business in the United States to patent stuff that is identical, but just with a slightly different variation. So Prilosec is a very successful drug against the acid reflux, went off patent, and I think it's AstraZeneca produced a Nexium, which is the same organic composition. It's just, if you remember vaguely, one is left leaning, the other is right leaning, identical, okay? Yeah, the strategy, but that's a different thing. They are taking advantage that on the other side, there is a government that is not very flexible in paying. So I think that's the other problem of the healthcare in the United States is the vast majority of money is spent in the last 2 weeks of your life. And there is like a determination in trying to keep you alive at whatever cost. That, if you are a 15-year-old kid, is understandable. If you are 92, it's not as understandable, especially if you don't pay for it, okay? Because with dogs, we all have a reservation price, and after a certain time, the veterinarian doesn't receive any money, okay? I'm not saying we should, but we need to put some limit.
Don't point at me.
In the United States, it's a perverse situation because the healthy part of the population is on a private system, and the non-healthy part, the elderly, is on a state system. And they don't understand that it's socialized medicine. So you have the Republicans that say, don't touch get the government off my Medicare. Wait a minute, Medicare is government, but still, so I think it is so I'm actually thinking that after having taken on the big tech, my next objective is to take on big pharma.
Andrea, you had a question. Yeah. We still have 10 minutes. Let's collect all the questions.
So, it is true that we switch sides, so I would like to know first whether at the end of the day, after all what you said, you think that the world is going worse with respect to the Medici's time, or at the end of the day, we are doing better than in the past. So I don't want to sound too optimistic and illuministic and so on, but I think that, yes, there are all these problems, but we are better off today. And if I think about the comparison between Europe and the US and also our switching of positions, I mean, it is still the case, at least this is my impression, that the most important innovations in research, also in pharmaceutical products, in technology, come from the world that you're criticizing the most, while I don't see so many of these innovations coming out of Italy where we don't have these kind of things. Aren't you becoming a little bit too pessimistic?
Let's collect questions.
No, I want to answer this first. I want to answer this first, then we go to the other question. So let me give you a few statistics. In the entire Vietnam War, America had 50,000 casualties. That's the number of people who die every year of excess opioids. This is an epidemic that was invented by a pharmaceutical company because everybody knew, at least since the Opium War with China, that opium is bad and that people get addicted after 10 days and destroys your brain and there is no future. But in the United States, they patented and they started to distribute to everybody. Not only that, they call it Tylenol 3. When you go to get your wisdom teeth removed, you get a thing that is called Tylenol 3. You send it just a stronger version of Tylenol. Yes, there is opioid in it. They don't even tell you, okay? This is 50,000 people die like this. Another 50,000 died of suicide. Now, for the first time, uneducated people commit more suicide than educated people. It used to be the other way around. And another 50,000 died of alcohol and related diseases. And they are all uneducated people, uneducated, with a high school degree. By Italian standards, would be highly educated, but it's people without a college, okay? And if you sum all the people who died of the opioids epidemics from 2000 to today, is more than the US casualty in World War I and World War II put together, okay? How can you say that we're going to a better world? We're going to a world in which two people can control the information about everything, okay? They are more powerful than any dictator could even dream of being powerful. Yeah. Wait. Let's wait if I'm still alive in 10 years.
We'll talk next year. Yeah. Andrea, can you choose a person to ask the last question? Because, okay. Okay.
Well, just my question about intermediate liability, coming back to that, because you were talking about the US case, and yeah, there is no, like, almost, like, they can do everything they want in practice because of the freedom of expression. But in the EU, we do have liability for intermediaries and for copyright and hate speech, heavily criticized. We have other rules that apply on intermediaries, like the right to be forgotten. We have data portability now in the GDPR, which is like competition, kind of very good competition rule. Do you think that Europe is doing much better than the US? And if yes, you know that if we go a bit farther than Europe, what's next in terms of restrictiveness is China and Russia in terms of liability of intermediaries and the way in which intermediaries are regulated. So, yeah, just your thought.
Why don't we take notes? We collect the questions so that we give
Sirish Soni, I'm the ambassador of South Africa to Italy. The question I have is, are colleagues looking at state capture that is taking place in South Africa, or took place, with particular reference to the involvement of auditing companies like KPMG, computer firms like SAP, consulting firms like Bain, communication firms like Bell Pottinger, who are largely European and American companies. Thank you.
And one more question.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. One and okay.
I'm Jonas. I'm a PhD researcher here. So I have a question about. We've talked now about these. We talked about big tech companies and also now big pharma. And I was thinking about how, in your original example, you kind of use oil as the perfect kind of source of rent. But I'm wondering how, in this era of international capital mobility and increasingly intangible forms of capital, how does that affect the Medici circle? If you get my question. And then I'm Norwegian, and you spoke about oil, and we kind of managed to make sure that the companies that now extract oil from our resources are Norwegian owned and state owned, and we did that in part by doing things that are now illegal. So if you're a member of the WTO and you're a member of the agreement on government or public procurement, you cannot do the things, you cannot set the kind of make the kind of deals that Norway did back in the 70s. And now we are, of course, helping African countries aid, oil for aid, etc. But what they are doing is paying our private companies because they are no longer allowed to do what we did in order to protect our own rents. So these two kind of developments, I'm just wondering how they affect the Medici circle as you see it. Thank you.
And the last question.
One quick question, as we don't have much time. You mentioned also lobbying as a way of capturing politics. What kind of safeguards we could put in place to ensure that big businesses can't capture through lobbying, as we had the example of Monsanto, as you mentioned, with glyphosate in the EU? Thank you.
Thanks. You have more or less 4 questions.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
So let's start from the oil one. I think that I greatly admire Norway for what they were able to do. I think that they got lucky that they discovered oil when they were already a very well-structured democracy and not before. I think that had it happened before, would have been more difficult.
Other examples are Canada, Australia.
Yeah, Canada and Australia, so they are similar. But I think that the disproportion of source of wealth in oil in Norway is particularly striking, and they did particularly well. So I think that that's remarkable. I think that we all have an enormous responsibility of how we treat Africa, because the way licenses are obtained in Africa is corrupt, and our companies are helping that corruption. I think it's a new form of colonialism, and it's embarrassing that this is done by European companies, even more embarrassing when these companies are controlled by the local governments, who then send aids that are crimes when they help stealing the real money. And yes, you're absolutely right. The South African ambassador, you're absolutely right. I think that that's part of the responsibility of Western companies in helping corruption in Africa. And I think they say, oh, because when in Rome, you do like the Romans. But they don't understand that they actually contribute to starve people. And I think that we should make them more accountable. I don't think that they are. And we should make more accountable, number one, most important, for the protection of Africa. But number two, and then I go back to the mobility, for our own protection. Because when we have rich African oligarchs that launder their money through London and other places, they're going to infect those places, and they're going to infect global capitalism in a major way. So if we don't do it for the right reason, which is to protect them, we should at least do it for our selfish reason, which is to protect ourselves. Because I think that that's a super important problem. So going to the data protection, is the GDPR the gold standard? First of all, I premise I'm not an expert of privacy, so I speak a little bit out of term here. My inclination is to have a slightly different approach, which is I call a Causian approach. Cause actually did pay a lot of attention to transaction costs. So I would like to have a default, which is always in favor of consumers, that can be overturned, but is by design in favor of consumers, because companies are very good at overturning a default in favor of consumers, not the other way around. GDPR, I fear, is a little bit too intrusive, and I fear that puts quite large costs to new entrants. So I think that when you put regulation in place, you also want to see what are the competitive effects of regulation. And I think that it's much easier for Facebook to do it with GDPR than it is for a new entrant. And so we might miss the new entrants we so barely need. What are the solutions? Unfortunately, I have no magic wand. I think that is a bit case by case. I think a general approach is we should be much more careful on revolving doors. I think we should have much more transparency in what politicians do after they step down. And we should also, I know this is not very popular, but we should pay people better. Because politicians and also regulators, because if they are not paid, they immediately go, they take this as a sabbatical in between two jobs in the industry. And I think that that's very, very dangerous. So I think that that's an important step. As it is an important step to be more careful in academia, I think we owe to ourselves to do a little bit of self-policing. I tell you this pretty disgusting aspect. A famous professor wrote a bunch of articles in Italian, Spanish, and other newspapers in 2008, 2009, supporting the change of regime of Gaddafi, and saying that, the new Gaddafi is a new regime, is opening up, blah, 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 blah. Now, interestingly, he was a consultant for Gaddafi. Now, we know after Gaddafi was dismissed, etc., and there was no trace in the article he wrote that he had that affiliation. I think that this is an embarrassment, and we should have a rule that every time anybody writes an article, even an op-ed, particularly an op-ed, should disclose what are the potential conflicts.
Great. Sun is the best disinfectant, as they say, and
particularly in Italy.
Particularly in Italy. That's a very sunny place.
So I'd like to really thank Sergei and Luigi for what I think was a very interesting and lively conversation. Perhaps it is ironical that this session on capture of politics by business was sponsored and financed by Oxford University Press, but I don't think they captured us. So let me thank them again for making this possible, and thanks to all of you for coming.
Thank you.
Is this on? Hi. We will be hosting the live stream.